Okay, so here's a short story that goes along with one of the sections here in the Canadian Literature course. In particular, it's focused on the land issues, literature that's written that talks about the experience that goes along with being on the land or being near land and the environment that it creates. At times, the land can be in the natural environment, and so then there's different experiences and typical tones or moods that would go along with that compared to the land that is part of the constructed landscape. So cities, larger metropolises, airports, things like that. And again, there would be different experiences typical for those as well. This story is written by Guy Vanderhee, who is a Saskatchewan author. He's published a number of different novels. Some of them have actually even been made into films. He showed up and spoke in one of my English classes in university. So he's an author that's involved in the writing process and engaged in kind of sharing what writing is about with students. For this particular story, there's no comprehension questions to respond to afterwards. There's only a few things to look for as you read. And so as you go along, in particular, one of them is that you're looking for that this is evidence of the survival theme that's typical of Canadian literature, and for sure you'll find it. Another one is just that it's a typical Canadian experience. Or I think it might even say Saskatchewan experience or prairie experience, and you should recognize the elements that make it typical for experiences of Saskatchewan. But in particular, there's two elements for analyzing literature or incorporating in your writing with literature that you have covered before that you're asked to watch for in this story as well. One of them is bias that is developed in writing. Now, the bias can be positive or it can be negative. And when we talk about that, it's related to either characters, it could be topics, any number of things that through the language that the author uses about that, say it's a character, the words associated and the background associated with the character, the author either wants the reader to think positively about that character or to think negatively about them. And we know that that happens, especially, if you think about protagonists or antagonists as they're developed in stories. Obviously, the author wants to lead you down a path where you feel strongly for one character and have a defense kind of attitude towards the other. So at times they develop the bias that they want you to have and follow along with or agree with in the writing. And so you as a reader sometimes get to make those decisions about whether you feel strongly or negatively about characters or events or certain topics as they're discussed, because they might write about them somewhat neutrally or create kind of a balance to the way they talk about a topic, for example, so that it depends on the reader's personal or moral choices, whether or not they would also see it positively or negatively. But other times there are characters that are specifically developed to be negatively considered. And so that might be the case in this story here, and you have to look for evidence of the bias that is established by the author. There are things that the author wants readers to think negatively of, and things the author wants readers to think positively of. So you can look for the evidence of bias as you read along. And then the other one that is important to understand is inference. And writers will hint at different things in their writing and not always explicitly say it. And so this is a way to make the writing interesting, because if you only told everything in your writing, you're not making your readers really think about things or piece together questions that they have. Telling only in your writing gets boring and monotonous. That's why at times you want to hint at things, and eventually, it comes with practice that you learn how to do it effectively enough that they can consistently or accurately read what you're hinting at. But it is another tool in the writer's toolbox. So you were going to look for examples of both of these things here as we read along in this story. And then you're also looking for the survival theme and that this is typical of Saskatchewan experiences. Okay? So Home Place is the title of this short story. It was early morning. so early that Gil McLean loaded the Colt into the truck box under a sky still scattered with faint stars. The old man circled the truck once, checking the tailgate, the tires, and the knot in the halter shank, tottering around on legs stiff as stilts, shoulders hunched to keep the chill off him. He was 69 and mostly cold these days. 100 yards behind him, one window burned yellow in the dark house. That was his son Ronald, asleep under the bare light bulb and the airplanes. Whenever Ronald fled Darlene, the woman Gil McLean referred to as the Backpage's wife, he slunk back to his father's house in the dead of night to sleep in a room lit up like a Christmas tree. To her father-in-law, Darlene was the Backpage's wife because Ronald found her advertising herself in the classified section of a farm newspaper, right alongside sale notices for second-hand grain augers and doubtful chainsaws. So you might just pause here for a second and recognize that there is a bias already established with both Ronald and with Darlene. In particular, if he talks about Darlene as being someone that his son has to flee, Ronald fled Darlene, that she was advertising herself, that speaks very negatively. And even the fact that the son, if I go to a different color here to look at the bias that's developed for the son Ronald, Ronald fled Darlene, that he slunk back to his father's house, that doesn't speak very positively. So you might note here that there is a negative bias established for both Ronald, who seems kind of weak, and for Darlene, suspicious motivations or something. Okay. Dawn, so early morning, found the old man in a temper, a mood. It was the mare he had wanted when he rattled oats in the pail and whistled, but it was the gelding which had been lured. The mare, wiser and warier, had hung back. So this morning he had a green, rough-broke colt to ride. There was nothing for it, though. He needed a horse because his mind was made up to repair Ronald's fences. They were a disgrace. I'm just going to point in here that you might assume or might believe that because it's mentioned here that he wanted one horse but got another one that's described as being green and rough, a very inexperienced horse, you might think that there's some foreshadowing here. Foreshadowing is hinting at an outcome, something that may affect the outcome. And the fact that he wanted an experienced horse, but he got a rough horse, a green horse, might speak to a potentially negative outcome as a consequence. And again, there's a little bit of bias maybe established here that the father was going out in a bad mood to repair his son's fences that were a disgrace. So this might also speak to a tense relationship between father and son. Generally, that was the way to catch what you wanted. Shake a little bait. It was what Darlene had done with Ronald, but she hadn't fooled Gil McLean for a second. He knew how it was. 4 years ago, his son and Darlene married after exchanging honeyed letters for 6 months. Ronald never breathed a word to him about any wedding. When Ronald's mother was alive, she used to say Ronald was too much under his father's thumb. But the one time he slipped out from beneath it, look at the results. So this also speaks to the tension between in the relationship. You'll also want to be able to establish tension in your own writing coming up. One morning, Ronald had driven off in the pickup truck. 12 hours later, he phoned from Regina to announce that he and his bride were bound for Plentywood, Montana, to honeymoon. Ronald was 38 then, had never been married, had never been engaged, had never even had a date that his father could recollect. It was a shock and a mystery. The way Gil figured it, Ronald must have proposed by mail before he ever met face-to-face with Darlene. Ronald didn't have it in him to offer himself in the flesh. That also speaks negatively about this character here as being someone who is weak. Ronald didn't have it in him to offer himself in the flesh to someone with whom he was actually acquainted. He would be too shy, too embarrassed for that. The old man folded himself into the cab of the truck, joint by joint. The best work, the worst sleep, he muttered to Ronald's lightened window as he drove under it. In the east, there were mare's tails in the horizon, fine as the vapor trails of jets, reddened by the rising sun. It was Gil McLean's speculation that his son married only to get his hands on land. Not land of Darlene's. She was a waif and a pauper and had none. But his land, Gil McLean's land. He never entertained the idea that Ronald might have married out of loneliness or lust or any feeling of the remotest kin to either. Just land. That was why he was sometimes troubled, wondering what share of responsibility was his to bear for Ronald's current unhappiness. Maybe he ought to have transferred the title sooner, but he had never trusted the boy's judgment. Again, background, biased against the character Ron. Events appeared to have confirmed his suspicions. Ronald had his own farm now, a wedding present. A married man needed land, so his father gave him the farm that the McLeans had always called the home place. So this is the connection to the title. It gave Gil satisfaction to see it pass from father to son, and he thought it might bring Ronald luck. The home place consisted of the original quarter Gil's father had homesteaded, the preemption, and another 320 acres, picked up cheap from a Finnish immigrant who went to pieces when his wife ran off on him. Over the years, the McLean family acquired other holdings, but the home place was special. So I'm going to pick a different color here for positive bias. The comments that are made about the land are positive here. Situated in a valley, it was a mix of rich bottom land and steep wooded hills. In the spring, down by the river, blizzards of gulls floated in the wake of tractor and disker, pursuing easy pickings, while hawks rode the air high above the lean hills, and shrieking fled to plunder these lazy storms of white birds. This is all very calm. There's a positive bias to this here. You have to just ignore the dog barking here. So when they're talking about the land, that's what attributes the positiveness. To Gil, it had all been beautiful. It was all he ever wanted, to possess that place and those sights. A day spent away from the farm made him restless, cranky. Returning to it even after the briefest absence, he acted oddly, dodging through the wires of a fence in his city clothes to wade about in his crops, hands running back and forth lightly over the bearded heads, the way another man might absent-mindedly stroke a cat. Right? All he ever wanted. Hands running back and forth lightly over the heads. So it's all spoken of very positively, right? Or he might suddenly stride off for the hills with all the energy and purpose of someone hurrying off to keep an appointment, tie flying over his shoulder. His wife used to say, Gil's gone off to satisfy himself, that nobody so much as shifted a cup of dirt on this place when he was away. What Gil never confided to his wife was that he felt more present in the land than he did in his own flesh, his own body. So this is how important the land is to Gil, okay? So positive bias again. Positive bias established for the land here as well. And you might think that there's kind of a sincerity in the character Gil, so that we like the character Gil. He's an honest man. He's hardworking. So there's some positive things about him as well, that, and obviously because he's the character that we are learning about the most, we want his success for whatever it is he's struggling for, and so that's what makes him the protagonist. Apart from it, he had no real existence. When he looked in a mirror, he stood at a great distance from what he regarded, but with the land, it was different. All he had, emptied of himself into it, he recognized. The road to the home place ran due east without deviating a hair, rising and falling regularly as a sleeper's breath as it made its way over a succession of bare hills. The emerging sun drew his eyes into a squint when he topped a rise. The blue shadows in the hollows forced them wide again. In the back of the truck, the slither and clatter of iron shoes was unremitting. The colt was either highly strung or lacked balance. If it lost its footing and fell, it would be a task to get on its feet again. The box was narrow and there was little room for maneuvering. He'd have to go back and get Ronald out of bed to help him. Turning Ronald out of bed was not an easy job. Despite his son's difficulties falling asleep, once he was gone, he wasn't likely to stir. Often he didn't wake before noon. Gil, on the other hand, roused to the slightest sound. That first night, the gritty scraping of the shoes on the stairs had been enough to jerk him out of a dreamless sleep. He'd never been one to lock doors. He had only himself to thank that night a night intruder was climbing up to him. It was like the television and its stories of grinning madmen invading houses and arming themselves with drapery cords and butcher knives to strangle and stab. The old man bunched up his pillow and held it out before him, ready to parry the first knife thrust. The footsteps, however, went on past his door. Only when the toilet flushed did he realize it had to be Ronald. Now this part here, where it starts up here, that first night, the gritty scrapings, there's a bit of inference included in this here, because the author doesn't tell you that there was one particular night. They just talks about that first night, and you don't know what that night is about. He only reveals it slowly and after the fact. So it requires a bit of filling in the blanks or guessing on your part of who it was in the night. And then this is the toilet flush that he realized it had to be Ronald. This is what confirms your belief or your thinking. He, Gil, simply shook in bed for several minutes, too angry and too relieved to ask himself what his son might be up to. Finally, he grew calm and curiosity prodded him out into the hallway to investigate. The light was on in Ronald's old bedroom and the door stood ajar. Ronald was lying flat on his back on the bed, staring up at his model airplanes. As a teenager, even as a young man, he had exhibited little interest in anything other than building models of airplanes from kits, squeezing tubes of glue, pasting on decals, and painting engine cowlings with brushes whose tips he sucked into needle points. I'm going to comment here as well that there is more tension developed between the two, father and son. Here, he exhibited little interest in anything other than building models, so not interested in the land. And back up here, the belief that Ronald didn't get up before noon, that's not an honest farmer. You know, it's odd for a hardworking farmer. To rest so much. So it kind of gives us the impression that the boy is lazy. And he's not interested in land the way the father is. So what the father cares about, the son doesn't seem to, which creates more tension between the characters here, okay? The models had never been removed in Ronald's room. 40 or more of them hung suspended from the ceiling on fine wires. His room was almost exactly as he had left it when he chose Darlene. That's a particular choice of words as well. Flying Fortresses, Mustangs, Zeros, Spitfires, Messerschmitts, a whole catalog of warplanes dangled there. The light in the bedroom was also as harsh, pitiless, and glaring. So this also is negative. So this whole, not necessarily just with Ronald, but the idea of these model planes, a negative bias towards them, that this is the thing that his son has his interest in instead of the land, which Gil cares and loves for. So there's a negative bias there as well in talking about these planes and his bedroom. So the light in the bedroom was also as harsh, pitiless, and glaring as it had ever been. When Ronald was 14, he had unscrewed the bulb in the ceiling fixture and replaced it with a more powerful one. He also dispensed with the shade because he wanted the models hanging beneath the light bulb to cast their shadows on his bedspread and linoleum in the way fighter planes and bombers passing between the sun and earth print their images on country lanes and city squares. These shadows were repeated everywhere around the room, and in their midst lay Ronald, gazing up into the strong light, gazing up at the undercarriages and silhouettes. So hopefully you can picture that. There's the bed, there's the light fixture, bulb on the wall, these planes hanging all over the place, and it's the light that comes down and casts these shadows on the floor. Over top of Ronald. He stares up at this bright light. So quite a strong description of the bedroom. "What's all this, Ronald?" his father said. "This is a hell of a time to pay a visit. It's past 2. And I'm just going to go back here. So far, there's no real dialogue here. Everything on all of the rest of these pages is narrative. The only thing as far as spoken dialogue so far is this part here. I'm going to highlight it in yellow. So this is the first dialogue, which if you're focusing on style, first spoken dialogue. And that's on page 3. And then there's nothing more until you get to page 5. So page 5 is, again, where the real dialogue starts beginning, which is kind of different for a short story that is, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9.5 pages long, right? So that's kind of an interesting element of the style as well. So dialogue here. "What's all this, Ronald?" his father said. "This is a hell of a time to pay a visit. It's past 2. Ronald said, "I can't stand it. I can't sleep there no longer." He kept his eyes fixed on the planes as he spoke. Gil knew there was talk going around town about his son and his daughter-in-law, all of it unfortunate. Darlene had come stamped with the word trouble. He'd seen it from day one. There as well continues that negative impression that you, the reader, are intended to have of Darlene, the wife. He had seen it from day one. The old man sighed and took a seat on the straight-back chair beside the dresser. Ronald was not exactly the forthcoming type. He was prepared to wait him out. After a considerable stretch of silence, his son said, "I should never have left." Gil knew what he meant. Ronald wasn't saying he ought not to have left Darlene. He was saying he should not have abandoned this room and the comfort and solace of those planes that could not fly. It was strange that given all the worrying he had done about Ronald and Darlene, Gil had never seen the real danger. So here's a moment that is escalating tension, so rising action. Whatever this is the real, one of the real problems. And now he did. The realization of what might lie ahead was like an attack of some kind. Before he could proceed, it was necessary to relieve the pressure prodding his breastbone and robbing him of breath. He arched his back and squeezed his eyes tight until it eased and he could speak. And speak he did, urgently, for a solid hour without interruption and with a drying mouth. He said it was the government and the courts. They'd gone and changed the marriage property laws so that the women ended up with half. So this is what part of the problem is. What happens if Ronald and Darlene break up? what will happen to the home place. I'm also going to point out here, you have a bit of inference when they talk about an attack and they talk about pressure in his breastbone robbing him of breath. This could be panic attack, especially because they inserted the word attack there. It could be the early signs of a heart attack. He is an older man, and he is highly stressed. So there's a bit more when we talk about rising action or problems. There's another part to that, is the physical health of the father. So the concern is who will get the land, or what would happen to the land if they separate. They'd gone and changed the marriage property laws so that women ended up with half of everything these days. Did Ronald know what that meant? Darlene could lay claim to half a share of the home place. No divorce, Ronald, he repeated. No divorce. Don't let that girl break up the home place. Don't you give her that satisfaction. Only when he had wrung this promise out of Ronald did he cease arguing. For a moment he was overcome by his son's loyalty. He patted the back of his hand and murmured, "Thank you, thank you." In a month, however, so a word like this is a contrast, transition of contrast. The word, however, means things are changing. So while he was able to get that promise from Ronald that there would be no divorce, Ronald was back creeping up the stairs. In baffled rage and fear of the future, Gil shouted through his bedroom door, "Don't expect any sympathy from me if you won't try to adjust." Ronald explained that he had a problem going to sleep in the same room, the same house as Darlene. That's the reason he came home every once in a while, to relax and catch up on his sleep. Not that it was easy for him to get to sleep in his old room either, but there he could manage it. What he did was stare up at the glowing bulb and plains until the moment arrived when he could feel the sun hot on his back, and suddenly he was winged and soaring, flying into sleep, released, sometimes for 12 hours at a time. So this boy is a bit of a daydreamer, or someone who avoids life, right? Ronald had been paying his visits to his father's to sleep for a year. So this time frame, that's part of setting. About the time they started, he commenced on improvements to the home place. This meant pushing brush and clearing land up top, above the valley in the hills. Gil had pointed out this was nothing but sheer craziness. Marginal land like that was suitable only for pasture. Cropping it would never repay the cost of breaking, and if the hillsides were stripped of cover, they would erode. So there's further tension between father and son, between these characters. But Ronald, who was usually willing to be advised, wouldn't listen to his father. A cunning and stubborn look stole over his face when he said, "We'll see. I hired another dozer. Pretty soon the brush piles will be dry and ready to burn." All spring, Ronald fired his huge gasoline-laced bonfires of scrub oak and poplar. The gutsy roar of flames was like constant static in his ears. Heat crumpled the air around him and stained it watery yellow. Greasy black clouds mounted indolently into the purity of blue skies. So for the positive and beautiful way that Gil thinks of the land, there are negative terms used here related to Ronald's use of the land. Gasoline-laced bonfires, flames, static in the ears, heat crumpled, stained, greasy black clouds. It's all very negative, right? So again, when we say that the bias can be established so that you don't like characters, there's a negative bias here as well, of the use of the land this way. And it's not just that Gil dislikes the way the land is used, it's likely as well that your narrator, who is your author probably thinks negatively as well about using the land in kind of such a way to strip it of all of its richness. The scars of the dozer blades fresh on the earth made the old man indignant. In places, the soil had been cut so deep that streaks of rubbly gravel were exposed. "You won't grow wheat in that," Gil McLean shouted. "So what'll it be? Carrots?" Smiling oddly, Ronald said, "I'm not growing nothing. I'll open a pit and peddle gravel to the Department of Highways by the yard." "That's not farming," his father returned, disgusted. "That's mining." It was all Ronald had any interest in at present, pushing bush, clawing up roots, burning. His face appeared hot, scorched. His eyes were forever weepy and red, their lids puffy and swollen, lashes singed away. The ends of his hair had crinkled, crisped, and gone white in the furnace heat. Everything else Ronald neglected, so there's growing tension here. He hadn't yet done his summer fallow, and his cattle were continually straying. This morning, Gil was determined to mend Ronald's fences, because he was ashamed of what the neighbors would think with his son's cows belly deep in their crops. We'll also come back to this topic here about time. What part of this is currently part of the story, and what parts of this are back story, flashbacks. You can also consider, what is the conflict in this story? Who is opposing, who or what is opposing the protagonist? Remembering that a short story is always about, a short story is of a character in a situation they don't want to be in. If that's the situation, you can consider what is the antagonizing force. Is it a character? And if that's the case, maybe it might be Ronald, who is the opposition to Gil and what Gil wants. Or it could just be the land. Or control, the use of the land. So not just Ronald as a character, but what he's doing to the land could also be the antagonizing force. So far, Ronald isn't even awake in the current parts of the story. The back and forth in the conversation he's had with his farmer father here, these are all backflashes. This is background. So Ronald's not even present at the time being when this story's happening. So you can put some thought into that. Who is the antagonizing force here? Who or what? So presently, the old man crested the last rise and the valley spread itself out at his feet. So this here is kind of a change into the present. This is what's currently happening in the story. And again, we'll come back and I'll show you the difference between what is present happening in the story and what is the backstory. The old man crested the last rise and the valley spread itself out at his feet. There were days when he would pull his truck over to the shoulder of the road and look with deep satisfaction at the slow river and the somber quilt of green and black fields, look until he had his fill. So again, positive bias when talking about the land. From such a height, the home place looked fatter and richer than with your nose shoved up in it. Up close, the dirt was dirt. There was no time for stopping and admiring this morning, though. He was in a hurry. Gil entered his son's property by a little used side gate because he didn't want Darlene spying his truck and reporting his doings to Ronald. So there is some conflict with both Darlene and Ronald. So again, when you're thinking about who the antagonizing force is, you can look to some hinting like that. He parked, unloaded the horse, and slung a duffel bag of tools and a coil of barbed wire on the saddle. Within minutes, he was riding down an old trail they had hauled hay on in summer and wood in winter in his father's time. Neither of those things would be possible now. Encroaching wild rose and chokecherry bushes had narrowed it, so a loaded wagon couldn't pass. The occasional sapling had taken root between the old ruts. Sunlight and sparrows strayed amid the poplar leaves overhead. Ronald's dozers hadn't reached this far yet, hadn't peeled all this back. Maybe his money would run out before they could. That was Gil's fervent hope. So all very positive. It was 8 o'clock before Gil located the first break in the fence. The wires were rotten with rust and would have to be replaced. He set to work. The old man ought not to have been taken by surprise. Now, you should recognize something foreshadowing in this line. When it says the words ought not to, the old man ought not to have been taken by surprise. It's kind of the same as saying he shouldn't have been taken by surprise, which tells us that he was taken by surprise, except they only hint at it. So this is an example of inference. Some students who aren't great, thoughtful readers yet will read past that sentence and not recognize that it's telling you something is about to happen. He knew the very nature of a young horse. So again, the horse that he was able to pick turns out to be of importance. And that very nature of a young horse was unpredictability. It happened when he was playing out 60 yards of wire, lazy man style. One end of the coil dallied round the horn of the saddle, the horse walking it out. It could have been the sound the wire made, hissing and writhing after them through the grass and weeds. It could have been that a barb nicked the gelding's hocks. Suddenly the colt froze in its tracks, laid back its ears, and trembled all over like a leaf. So tension is mounting significantly here because we know something's about to happen. Something surprised him. It, whatever it is that happened, could have been for all of these different reasons. Gil had been a horseman all his life, nearly all of his 70 years. He knew what was coming, and he fought it with all his strength to keep the gelding from pulling its head down between its forelegs. If the colt managed to get its head down, it would be able to buck. It managed. The old man's strength was not sufficient. The horse squealed, wriggled, snapped out its hind legs. Gil's lower plate popped out of his mouth. The sky tilted, and he fell. Right now, you should have a lot of questions because you don't know what the consequence or the outcome is of the horse bucking. You can also look to short little phrases like these two here that speak to writer's style, that for emphasis or effect, they're able to insert these very short 2-word sentences. So there's a variety in the sentence strength and all of that. But if you're looking for where your climax is, you don't know yet what happened. You know something's about to happen. And still here, you know something is about to happen. But you don't know yet whether it's going to work positively or negatively for our character. It was bad luck to get snarled in the wire. And that might tell you right there that whatever the outcome is, if you're building up to your climax here, it could be that the horse was unpredictable. It could be that he realized he had to keep the horse's head up, and it could be right here that it was bad luck to get snarled in the wire. This tells us maybe that the outcome is going to be very bad for Gil, and so this might be your climax line. The colt dragged him several hundred yards, the old man skipping and bounding and tumbling along behind like a downed water skier without the presence of mind to relinquish his grip on the tow rope. Remembering here that your arrows down after this are what tells you the outcome. So no, you don't have a question anymore about what the outcome is. You know it's bad. All this does is fill in the blanks, right? That's your falling action. So that's what you've got here already, I think, is your falling action. When it had winded itself, the horse came to a halt, stood rolling its eyes and snorting. The old man began to paw himself feebly, searching his pockets for a pair of fencing pliers, with which to cut himself out of the jumble of wires. Using the pliers, he had to move cautiously and deliberately, so as not to excite the skittish colt. Nevertheless, when the final strand of wire parted with a twang, the colt kicked him twice in a convulsion of fear before trotting off a stone's throw away. There it circled about anxiously, stepping on the ends of the dragging reins and bruising its mouth. I'll ask you a question here too. If you could find any greater tension anywhere in here, then that would prove to me that we haven't had the climax yet. But if instead it seems like this is all just kind of falling into place, that you already know that he's going to be in great danger, and you're just filling in the blanks to explain how bad that danger is, then that means that there isn't significant tension, and as things continue on, it just relieves your uncertainty more and more. So it circled anxiously, stepping on the ends of the dragging reins and bruising its mouth. The old man lay still, taking stock. There seemed to be a lot of blood. The wire had cut him in many places. He sat up and the blood gushed out of his nose and mouth and spilled down his jacket front. He peered about him, dazed. The colt had dragged him to a desolate place. Ronald's dozers had been at work. Here, there was nothing but bare, black earth, engraved by caterpillar treads, piles of stones, and the remains of bonfires, charred tree trunks furred in white, powdery ash. So this is all very negative. While he sat up, the blood continued to pour from his nose and mouth and nose. It was better to lie back down. He was feeling weak, but he told himself that was because he had taken nothing that morning but a cup of instant coffee. I'll rest, and my strength will come back, he told himself. Gil closed his eyes and became aware of the powerful scents of sage, milkweed, and grass. How was this possible in a place scoured clean? Then he realized they were coming from his clothes. He had been ground into them by the dragging. So his love of the land, this part here is a bit, you could say, symbolic. That he's literally been ground into the land now, that the land is on him. The sweet sounds are surrounding him. Even though his location, where he's currently laid bare there, is barren. It's been stripped by the sun, who he disagrees with. During the next 3 hours, he tried a number of times to sit himself up, but the blood always ran so freely from his mouth, he resigned the attempt. Not yet, he muttered to himself. In a while. He had little sense of passing time. There was only thirst and the stiff, scratchy ache of the wounds on his face, hands, and legs. When the sun shone directly down into his face, he realized it was noon. The bright light in his eyes and the time of day made him think of Ronald. He would be waking now, looking up at his airplanes. He had asked Ronald, "What is it with you? Why do you stare up at those planes?" And Ronald had said, "I like to pretend I'm up there, high enough to look down on something or somebody for once in my life." Gil had laughed as if it were a joke, but it was an uneasy laugh. Suddenly, the old man was seized by a strange panic. Making a great effort, he sat himself up. It was as if he hoped the force of gravity would pull everything he just now thought and saw down out of his head and drain it away. What he saw was Ronald's lashless eyes, singed hair, red-burning face. What he thought was that such a face belonged to a man who wished to look down from a great height on fire, on ruin, on devastation, on dismay. When the old man collapsed back into the wire, he saw that face hovering above him, looking down on him. "You've got no right to look down on me," he said to the burning sky. "I came to fix your fences. I gave you the home place and showed you how to keep it." I'm just going to point out here as well, if the question was who who the antagonizing force is in these last moments that he has towards the end, just before the end of the story. He's addressing Ronald. That could be used as evidence that Ronald is the antagonist. He's the one that's doing things or working against Gil's success. I was going to point out here something too. High enough to look down on something or somebody for once in my life. And then he sees his son above him. He saw Ronald's face hovering above him. So what you should recognize here is that there is a metaphor here of, Ronald is above. He wants to look down on destruction. He's thinking of fighter planes, but the destruction here is the barren land. That's what Gil would say is the destruction. And in the end here, it's now the harsh sun that is looking down on a very injured Gil. There's a parallel here, I guess is what I would call this, a parallelism. Parallelism. The destruction from the plains here is similar to the destruction of the land. There is the metaphor here of the plains to the land. Ronald's use of it, that would be the metaphor. The parallelism here is the similarity in the story structure, looking down on something, looking down on another thing. I'm also going to point out here, and I'm just going to erase this because of the way I circled it. There is some parallelism in the writing structure here. You've got on fire, on ruin, on devastation, on dismay. There's a pattern created with that sentence structure, and that is also called parallelism. You've got no right to look down on me, he said to the burning sky. I came to fix your fences. I gave you the home place and showed you how to keep it. His vehement voice filled the clearing and argued away the afternoon. It became harsher and louder when the sun passed out of Gil's vision and he could not raise himself to follow its course. This is kind of inference here, meaning he couldn't even turn his head to face the sun as it was setting. The horse grew so accustomed or used to this steady shouting and calling out that only when it suddenly stopped did the gelding prick its ears, swing its head, and stare. So you could pause this recording to stop and think about this final sentence and what you think it means. But what you should recognize, if you're getting better and used to using inference, is that there's also something hinted at here. It's when that yelling and screaming suddenly stopped that the gelding pricked up its ears. And why did it stop? We will assume it's hinted at that Gil dies. If anything, at least he passes out, but because nobody knows where he is, he's likely to die. They've talked about the blood loss. You've also got some parallelism here. The gelding pricked up its ears, swung its head, and stares. So you have a pattern again to that kind of a sentence set up. You've got the Oxford comma there. So some things to think about with the writing there. The author has used, you have to see the comparison of that idea of Ronald liking the idea of looking down on destruction and of the light glaring down upon those fighter planes in his bedroom. Compare that to Ronald looking down on the destruction of the land. He's scraping it barren and he thinks he's using the land in a positive way, but Gil will see that as the destruction of the land he loves. So that's one thing. There's also some irony. There's irony here in that Gil's out there on the land he loves to go out and do a favor or help his son out. And if this horse was going to buck and injure him with getting caught in the barbed wire, the irony would be that you would hope that the author would let Gil die on the land that he loved, but instead Gil dies on the barren land, the land that's been scraped clean, right? So that's a situational irony. What the outcome is different than what you might have expected would have happened. And again, that's a choice on the author's part and they hint at it. He mentions to you that the scent of the land that Gil loves is there in this scoured clean area of his homestead, but not the land that he loves. That's not the part that he'll be dying on. So you've got some parallelism, you've got metaphor, you've got symbolism, you've got irony, you've got the question of who is the antagonizing force, you've got the positive and negative bias that's established, you have several examples of inference or what's hinted at. And then I'm just going to show you one more thing here, and I'm just going to pause and pull it up here. Okay, the other part that I'm just going to point out to you here is this is the same story, and what is highlighted here is everything that's happening as the backstory. So, the story starts off that early morning. The house is before him. His son is there in the house sleeping. He went to get a horse and got the colt instead of the experienced male. But then the yellow here, or orange, whatever you want to call that, is what jumps back to the background of the story. And the background is what establishes that tension between the father and son and the reason for it. And so everything here in this writing that's highlighted in this orange color is what's happened in the past, not what's currently happening. And you can see that there are large parts of this that are it's almost half the story. If you look over here on the left side of your page by how much is highlighted, that's half of these 9.5 pages essentially that is created as the background to that tension or of what's currently contributing to the events happening now in the present of this story. And then you can see here that at the end, after they've established all of the reasons for this tension and the background between both of the father and son's ideas or purpose of the land, then it goes on to what's currently happening and the events unfold there as they do. So some interesting decisions made by this author in putting together this story in particular. And again, if I go back to the initial idea that you were asked to look for how this fits with the idea of survival, there could be several ways. It could not just be survival of an individual after an injury on the land, but it could be survival of traditional ways, surviving against more modern ideas or uses of the land. It could be the survival of, how would I put it? Survival of modern technologies compared to, the more romanticized ideas of the relationship to the land versus exploiting the land, right? So the survival theme is there. And then as a typical Saskatchewan experience, we know that this is typical because we've actually even had a student in our school who had this very experience, was out repairing fences or something with animals and was really damaged by a horse getting tangled in the wire. That's a very common experience. Tensions between family members over how to use the land, how to divide the land, even divorce, so separation or dividing of assets after a divorce, something like that. All of those things are Saskatchewan experiences in particular. And we've already covered as well that the bias is positively or negatively established, and that the inference is used to hint at different things that you're meant to understand of the story and the writing. So, interesting story. Hopefully it gives you some ideas for tricks or strategies that you might think to include in your own short story assignment coming up next.